let's talk about what it means to take a rough cut to the next level. So here I have compiled a comparison of my newest film, Through Fire and Brimstone, and I've assembled a comparison of each scene, going scene by scene, comparing the rough cut version to the final cut. If you're interested in watching this whole video, it's been uploaded as a separate video. But here I'm just going to kind of cover some of the main points and talk about what it means to polish a short film, what really happens during the editing process, and for me, what are some of the key things that differentiate my early edits from my later edits. And I think one of the key takeaways I'll go ahead and say is that there's some scenes that are very similar to the final version as they are to the first version that I make. And I think the most important part of that process happens early on. But maybe just to drive that home, let's think about a good scene to compare that. Maybe we start with the first scene. Let's go ahead and watch both versions of that without further ado. I won't give any commentary. I'll just let the scene play out. How about that?
From the top, action.
I don't understand. Why don't you want me to do any new music on Sunday?
Well, most of the congregation's my father's age, Trinity. And when he preaches, he speaks their language. I think the music should be spoken in their language, too.
But traditions breed complacency, Jethro. The Spirit of God is alive and well, and sometimes he demands we leave behind our routines.
These old hymns aren't routines to be broken. They're authentic modes of worship. Now, for these old people to try and sing along to your newest songs, I just don't think they could sing it with the same honesty that they'd have otherwise. Look, we'll settle this debate tomorrow, all right? I'll send you a song list by then. That's the end of the take. We're gonna do this whole thing in close-ups. I think that'll be easier to direct.
For when you stand up so that your body.
That's gonna be a different shot.
Sometimes God's timing confuses us. Sometimes he picks us up and shakes us out of our apathy. Sometimes the soil must be made soft before the seed can be planted.
I don't understand. Why don't you want me to do any new music on Sunday?
Well, most of the congregation's my father's age, Trinity. And when he preaches, he speaks their language. I think the music should be spoken in their language, too.
But traditions breed complacency, Jethro. The Spirit of God is alive and well, and sometimes he demands we leave behind our routines.
These old hymns aren't routines to be broken. They're authentic modes of worship. Now, for these old people to try and sing along to your newest songs, I just don't think they could sing it with the same honesty that they'd have otherwise. Look, we'll settle this debate tomorrow, all right? I'll send you a song list by then.
Hey Jethro, I tried to reach you earlier and your dad wasn't responding. Could you ask him something?
Sometimes God's timing confuses us. Sometimes he picks us up and shakes us out of our apathy. Sometimes the soil must be made soft before the seed can be planted.
All right. So now that you've seen both versions of that first scene, and just like to be clear, this is not like the first thing you see in the film. There is an opening title sequence, but I didn't think it made sense to compare that, because that's something that was created in the edit. It's a VFX shot, so there would be nothing to compare it to with a rough cut version. So the first official scene is this dialogue scene here, and I think this is just another example of there's a lot of superficial changes. There's things like the sound effects, the soundtrack, for instance. There's no music in that first version, but a lot of the core elements of the scene, of course, like the actual footage is there, but most of it stays in the same order. There's a couple of shifts throughout it, especially with this moment where, we see the reveal of the body here. And so that's something that there was a couple shots that were just kind of, in the wrong order, and it kept kind of cutting away from it. And I want to see it and then cut away, but not cutting away from it when we see it, just to make sure the flow of information is there. And so that kind of became an important thing to just make sure that everything was being communicated clearly. so much of this film I felt like was a test in communication and, trying to follow an idea through as it develops differently in different scenes. And so part of, editing is also meshing scenes together. And that's something that kind of, as I've prepared for, this kind of sermon at the end of the scene, there's a voiceover line. I think something that's interesting about this film is that, it uses this kind of nonlinear storytelling in the edit to kind of create a voiceover element, as if it's a narrator, as if it's an omniscient narrator, because it's somebody who's reflecting on their experiences as we see them, but it's coming out of a future scene, which is a sermon in a future scene. And so I just thought that that'd be an interesting way to edit the film. But that's something that just like making sure that that feels like cohesive, like just trying to make sure that that worked and made sense with the soundtrack and the sound editing and mixing. There's different ways to achieve that. I brought down the ambient noise as we approach that to kind of say like, all right, the audience is moving away from the diegesis of the film. And now let's become, let's transform it into something that's more emotional. What you're seeing on screen is not just what's happening, it's what someone's feeling. And that was something that I thought about. But also, like I said, it's like the main parts of that scene did stay the same. A lot of the, I didn't really change takes. Like the dialogue used the same takes. Even the color correction, I did that pretty early on in that first rough cut. I was like, okay, I like where these colors are landing. I'm happy with the way things look. It has a kind of wintry feel. It's not this bright, saturated summer day. Colors aren't intense. It's supposed to be a little bit muted. It's a darker story. And I wanted to convey that all from the very beginning, even if there was a lot of light in the scene. But it's also, there's so much light. It's overcast so that the sky is pure white. And so these are all things that I want to just emphasize in the color grade. It's this kind of wintry day. It was all filmed in December. And edited during December. Something you see, of course, like if you want to watch this whole video, you see, if you look at the dates for the rough cut, it changes, right? So I'm not just saying, oh, here's one rough cut that I'm pulling from. It's the first version of each of these scenes. So I edited this, this scene for the first time on the 3rd of December, but I might have edited a different scene on the 9th of December. And so that's just, you see that as you watch, there's different dates that come up because there wasn't a version of this scene, this news scene that existed before the 14th, for example. And so, if you want to watch the whole video, you can see that there's kind of a built-in timeline of when I even got to editing certain scenes, and they just didn't exist until a certain point. So I do pull from different cuts as I decide, like, what is the first rough cut of this scene. And so that's kind of a different, you can see the difference there. But I want to see if maybe there's a more dramatic example. Here's another thing that I just want to, point out is that just like as I edit a film, of course, like, one of the superficial elements is that the music is actually added, right? Like you noticed in the previous scene. But let's like see what it looks like to compose and, because sometimes I compose a track and it happens all at once, but sometimes there's sometimes I compose it and then I produce it. So let's kind of just take a look at what it might look like before the final version of the track is there, but after I've written it and it's enough to edit the scene.
Now I felt in my heart that I had so much to express, but no words to use. So I made myself a blank canvas so that hopefully the Lord would speak for me. Now I felt in my heart that I had so much to express, but no words to use. So I made myself a blank canvas so that hopefully the Lord would speak for me.
Yeah, so that's just a very obvious example of like just what it looks like. And just the fact that like stuff like music, it's like, you can like, massage an edit, right? You can work with it and have different elements kind of come into place and use temporary elements. Like, I don't know, like, of course. But that's something that just like being comfortable with that and just being comfortable with the idea that your edit might have a lot of temporary assets is something that I think like sometimes requires learning. Like sometimes it's like just being comfortable with like, oh, I don't have that asset yet, but I can still kind of start to assemble and try to figure out like what my film looks like and how I want to tell the story. And there's questions about pacing and tone, and there's things you can figure out even if you haven't done, everything yet, even if the music's not produced, even if the sound mixing isn't there, even if there's a visual effect shot that you haven't worked on yet, or a graphic, or whatever it is. For example, it's like for this first rough cut, I made like a storyboarded version of the film, of course, that's just storyboards before I filmed, where I also like read the script and like, recorded a voiceover for that and edited that together with the storyboards. And then I pulled from that as I was doing the rough cut, whenever there were moments that like, if there was a insert shot that I wasn't sure if I wanted to film, or a visual effect shot that, like I could still edit in the storyboard before producing the visual effect shot. And you see this all through, especially these ending scenes, where there's a car chase. And of course, in the final film, there's all these visual effects elements, and CG, 3D animation. But, just to start to cut that together, it's just throwing storyboards in and trying to figure out the pacing of things. That was so important, and I was so thankful that I did storyboards. And I think that it was an interesting editing process because it was something that was very music-driven to figure out the car chase. Like in the final version of the film, there's this kind of tick-tock kind of like beat that you follow because it's a countdown. It's all about this countdown to the end of the world. And so hearing that kind of ticking clock in the soundtrack was really important, and I wanted the editing of the scene to reflect that. But, I mean, during the first rough cut version, there was no music. And it was just, but it still allowed me to figure out the pace of the scene. And then so the next thing I did after this version of the scene, where I had storyboards in and, was able to figure out the pace of it, then I added the music, recut it, retimed it to that, and then produced the visual effects. That was the order I went in, and that's just kind of what made sense to me because I really wanted to ground the timing of everything in that beat. And the tempo was at the rhythm of a ticking clock, right? So you have that, like, beat per second, literally a beat per second. And that was very important to me to kind of have that feel of it. And does that mean that the music feels slow sometimes for a car chase? Maybe, but I don't know. I think I think it was that ticking clock feel, I feel like is really beneficial. And I think it still feels intense, and I don't think I've compromised anything there. I'm happy with all that, with, how everything turned out. And I think if you want to go, like, take a deeper dive into comparing the rough cut to the final version, I totally recommend, like, watching this whole thing and comparing different scenes, and just seeing what it looked like before a lot of work went into it. But you also see that a lot of the important work happened in the very beginning of the editing process. So much of the most important part of my editing process happens pretty quickly as I'm, assembling shots together, figuring out, like, just intentionally what do I want to show, which take do I want to use, right? What's the best performance? And I'm editing that together, and which angles do I want to use? Most of that happens very quickly. And for this film, it's like I said, I did color grading very quickly. I don't always do it that quickly. Sometimes color grading is one of the last things I do. But for this film, I thought it made sense to kind of go ahead and settle in on that tone, figure out, like, just visually the kind of color scheme I wanted to use. And that impacted the way I did visual effects shots. That impacted, the way that I, created graphics, just, like, figuring out that color scheme, figuring out, the visual tone. To me, that was a very important part of the process. But I do recommend watching the rough cut to final film comparison. It goes scene by scene, and you compare each scene side by side, essentially. So I recommend that if you're interested in learning more about my filmmaking process. So without further ado, I'll let you go.